My 18-year-old son stood up in the middle of a crowded restaurant and told me, in front of his mother and the man who replaced me, that I would never be half the man his stepfather is. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I paid the check, drove home in silence, and by 3 a.m, I'd made a decision that would end up exposing something far bigger than a family dinner. Something involving my son's own identity, $200,000, and a man who'd spent 6 years building his image out of debt he never told anyone about. This is the story of how one sentence at a birthday dinner led me straight into a fraud that had been sitting quietly under my son's name since he was 14 years old. My name is Richard Hale, and I'm 51 years old. 22 years ago, I married a woman named Carol Denning. We had our son, Ethan, 2 years into the marriage, and for a while things were good. Not perfect, no marriage is, but good. I worked as a structural engineer. Long hours some weeks, but I made every school play, every little league game I could physically get to, every parent-teacher conference Carol would let me attend. The marriage ended when Ethan was 9. I won't drag you through every detail of why. Infidelity was involved, though not on my side, and I think that's the only part that matters for this story. Carol left, took Ethan with her per the custody arrangement, and within 18 months, she married a man named Gregory Voss. Gregory ran 3 car dealerships across 2 counties. Money was never a question for him. He had a lake house, a boat, 2 luxury vehicles in his driveway that he rotated depending on his mood. When I found out Carol was marrying him, my only real fear wasn't losing her. That had already happened. My fear was losing my son to a life I couldn't compete with financially. I was right to be afraid, though not for the reason I expected. Ethan was 10 when Gregory first started showing up to his birthday parties. 12 when Gregory bought him his first dirt bike, something I'd told Ethan he'd have to save up for himself, a lesson in patience and earning things I genuinely believed in. Gregory undid that lesson in one Saturday afternoon with a check and a bow on the handlebars. I don't blame a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old for being dazzled by that. Kids aren't equipped to see the difference between generosity and compensation. All Ethan knew was that one man made him wait, and the other man made his wishes disappear instantly. Slowly, over years, Gregory became the fun dad. I became the dad who set rules, who couldn't always make the game because of a work deadline, who lived in a modest 3-bedroom house instead of a lake property with a private dock. By the time Ethan turned 16, most of our conversations had shrunk to logistics, pickup times, whether he'd be at my place this weekend or Gregory's lake house. I kept showing up anyway every scheduled weekend, every holiday I was owed, every school event I could attend, because showing up was the only currency I had left that Gregory's money couldn't replicate. Or so I told myself. The distance between us didn't announce itself all at once. It crept in through 1,000 small moments. A birthday call that went to voicemail, a school project Ethan mentioned in passing that he'd already finished with Greg's help, a Christmas morning where he opened my gift, a hand-built model car kit I'd spent 3 weekends assembling with him in mind, and set it aside within 4 minutes to get to Gregory's much larger pile of unwrapped boxes. I told myself it was a phase. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was Ethan's 18th birthday this past spring. Carol had arranged a dinner at a steakhouse downtown. Ethan, Carol, Gregory, and me. I almost didn't go. Something in me knew the evening wouldn't end well. But it was my son's birthday, and 18 felt like a milestone worth showing up for. Dinner started fine enough. Then Gregory brought up a gift he'd already arranged, a car. Not just any car, a nearly new sedan fully paid, sitting in Ethan's name at one of his dealerships waiting to be picked up. Something about the way he said "in Ethan's name" caught my attention that night, though I didn't understand why until much later. At the time, I only felt the familiar tightening in my chest, watching another piece of my son's foundation being poured by someone else's hands. I said something about maybe Ethan earning a car through a part-time job once he started school. The same lesson I tried to teach with the dirt bike years earlier. Ethan's face changed. Something in him that had been building for years finally broke loose. "You always do this. You act like everything has to be earned the hard way because that's the only way you know how to live." Greg actually gives without making it a lesson every single time. "You'll never be half the man he is." The table went quiet. Carol looked down at her plate. Gregory, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. I sat there absorbing 18 years condensed into one sentence from my own son's mouth. I didn't argue. I paid my half of the check, told Ethan happy birthday, and drove home in silence, so complete I could hear my own heartbeat over the radio I never turned on. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my home office until nearly 3 in the morning, running through 18 years of memories, trying to figure out where exactly I'd failed so badly. Around 2:30, something shifted in me. Not anger, clarity. I realized I'd spent years trying to compete with Gregory on his terms, value measured in things, in ease. I had never once tried to show Ethan what I was actually worth, because I'd assumed showing up quietly would eventually speak for itself. It hadn't. I pulled out an old filing cabinet. Inside were things I'd never shown Ethan. Every child support payment record going back 17 years, none of them ever late. A folder of every school event program I'd kept. A notebook where, for years, I'd written brief notes after every visit with Ethan. I found an entry from when Ethan was 11. He asked me today why I don't buy things like Greg does. I told him it's because I want him to know the difference between being given something and earning it. He said that sounded boring. Maybe he's right. But I think someday he'll understand. Reading my own handwriting, 8 years old now, I realized that day had finally come. Except instead of understanding, it had produced resentment. I gathered everything into a single folder. Financial records showing every payment every year. Timesheets from a hardware store I'd worked weekends at during a lean year, specifically to keep child support current. Ticket stubs from every play and game I'd saved. I didn't send the folder immediately. I wanted this to land as an explanation, not a weapon. But before I could arrange a meeting with Ethan, something else happened. Something that had nothing to do with folders or notebooks at all. 2 weeks after the dinner, I got a call from my accountant, a woman named Priya Nair, who'd handled my taxes for over a decade. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd recently taken on a new client referred through a mutual contact, someone doing forensic bookkeeping work for a regional bank that had flagged unusual loan activity connected to a string of car dealerships. She didn't mention names. She had no idea I had any connection to the story at all. But something about the description, 3 dealerships, 2 counties, vehicles registered under family members' names as a financing workaround, sat wrong in my stomach the second she said it. I told myself it was nothing. Coincidence. But that night, the memory of Gregory's exact phrasing at dinner kept circling back to me. It's already in Ethan's name. Not I bought him a car. In his name, specifically. I want to be honest with you about something. I am not by nature a suspicious man, but something about that dinner conversation wouldn't let me rest. And once an engineer starts noticing a structural inconsistency, we can't simply look away from it. I called Priya back the following week and asked, carefully, without revealing why, whether dealership financing fraud involving family members' names was common. She explained something I hadn't known, that some dealerships facing cash flow problems will register vehicles or open lines of credit under employees' or relatives' names to artificially inflate sales numbers or secure additional lending, essentially borrowing against people who never agreed to be borrowed against. It's a serious form of fraud, she said, and it usually unravels the moment someone stops paying attention to their own credit report. I asked Ethan, casually during a phone call 2 days later, whether he'd ever pulled his own credit report. He said no, he'd never needed to, he was 18 and had never opened a credit card. I told him it might be smart to check before college, just as a precaution. He agreed, mostly to humor me, and said he'd get around to it eventually. I didn't wait for eventually. With his permission, I helped him pull the report myself that same week. What we found stopped both of us cold. There were 3 auto loans on Ethan's credit file, going back 4 years, starting when he was 14 years old. 3 loans totaling just over $91,000, all originated through Voss Auto Group dealerships, all listed as active accounts. Ethan hadn't co-signed anything. He hadn't signed anything at all as far as either of us could determine. He was 14 when the first one opened. Ethan went pale. "The dirt bike," he said quietly. "This is from the dirt bike, isn't it? And the car he was going to give me for my birthday, it wasn't a gift. It was another loan." I didn't have an answer yet, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Gregory hadn't been giving Ethan generous, unconditional gifts all these years. He'd been using my son's identity, and likely Carol's as well, to secure financing that kept his struggling dealerships afloat, dressing debt up as generosity, letting a 14-year-old boy believe he was simply loved more extravagantly than his own father could manage. I called a family friend who practiced consumer finance law, a man named Dennis Okafor, and explained everything. He confirmed what I feared. This pattern, vehicles financed under a minor's identity without consent, was not simply unethical. It was identity fraud, a federal matter once you crossed certain dollar thresholds, and $91,000 crossed them easily. Dennis asked the obvious question. Did I want to pursue this quietly, through a private resolution with Gregory directly, or did I want to report it formally through the bank's fraud department and potentially law enforcement? I sat with that question for 3 days. Part of me wanted to march straight to Gregory's dealership and demand an explanation face to face, but I kept thinking about that folder sitting on my desk, the one I'd built to show Ethan quiet, patient proof rather than loud accusation. I decided this needed the same approach. Not revenge, not humiliation. Just undeniable, patient truth laid out carefully enough that no one could argue with it once it was finally shown. I hired Priya formally to build a complete picture. Over the following 3 weeks, working carefully and legally through public loan records, credit bureau documentation, and Ethan's own signed authorization, she traced the full pattern. 4 vehicles financed under Ethan's identity since he was 14. 2 additional lines of credit opened under Carol's name that she also had no clear memory of authorizing. By the time Priya finished her report, the picture was clear and considerably worse than I'd expected. Gregory's dealerships weren't simply stretching 1 or 2 loans as a cash flow workaround. Over 6 years, he'd financed close to $230,000 across various family and employee names, including Ethan's, Carol's, and at least 2 long-term employees who had no idea their names had been used either. I made the decision to go to Carol first before Ethan, before anyone else. I called her, asked to meet, and told her honestly that I'd found something serious involving Gregory's business and Ethan's identity. She listened to the whole thing in near silence, her face going through something I recognized from years of marriage, the particular expression of someone recalculating everything they thought they knew about a person they trusted. She admitted quietly that she'd signed several documents over the years without reading them fully, trusting Gregory's assurances that they were just formalities. He told me the dirt bike was a promotional item he was allowed to gift employees' families, she said. I never once thought to question where the paperwork actually went. I told her I wasn't here to make her feel foolish. Gregory had built an entire persona around effortless generosity, specifically because it was profitable to be believed rather than questioned. Carol asked what I planned to do. I told her the truth. I wanted Ethan protected first and foremost, his credit cleared, his name removed from every fraudulent account. Before anything else happened, Carol made a decision in that conversation that surprised me. She said she wanted to be the one to confront Gregory directly with the documentation in hand, rather than have it arrive as a surprise through a legal notice. We arranged the conversation for a Sunday evening at the lake house Carol's request. I agreed to come, mostly because Ethan asked me to be there. Gregory came in from his boat dock a little after 6, expecting an ordinary family dinner. Instead, he found Carol, Ethan, and me seated in his living room, a folder of documents laid out on the coffee table between us. I watched his expression shift the moment he saw the folder, a flicker of recognition before he'd even opened it. Carol spoke first. She laid out the credit reports, the loan documents, the pattern Priya had traced across 6 years. Gregory tried for the first 90 seconds or so to frame it as a misunderstanding. Ethan stood up at that point. I watched my son, 18 years old, find a version of his voice I'd never heard before. "You used my name for 4 years," he said. "I was 14 when the first loan opened. You let me think you loved me more than my own father because you were generous. You weren't generous. You were borrowing against a kid who trusted you." Gregory's composure finally cracked. He admitted haltingly that the dealerships had been struggling for nearly 3 years, that a downturn in margins combined with an expansion he'd financed too aggressively had left him searching for any available credit source, and that using family names had started small. One loan, meant to be repaid quickly and quietly. Before it became a pattern, he told himself he'd unwind eventually. Carol told him, in a voice I hadn't heard her use in over a decade, that this ended that night. She would be filing a formal complaint with the bank's fraud division the following morning, with or without his cooperation. The following months moved slower than any of us wanted. Ethan's fraudulent accounts were eventually cleared, his credit repaired through the bank's internal fraud resolution process. Gregory's dealerships entered a restructuring process. 2 of the 3 locations closed within the year. None of that in the end was really the point of this story for me. What mattered happened quietly in the weeks after that confrontation at the lake house, when Ethan asked if we could go fishing one more time before he left for college. We spent 4 hours on that riverbank. I taught him the same knot I'd taught him at 7, and this time he actually remembered it. We didn't talk much about Gregory or the loans or the confrontation. We talked about his classes, his roommate assignment, his nervousness about starting somewhere new. At one point, sitting quietly with our lines in the water, Ethan brought up the folder I'd shown him weeks before. "You spent 18 years proving you loved me with things that cost you time instead of money," he said. He spent 6 years proving he loved me with things that cost me money I didn't even know I owed. I don't think I understood the difference until both truths were sitting on a table at the same time. He calls me now most weeks, sometimes just to talk about nothing in particular. Small things. The kind of things that only get shared with someone you trust will still be there tomorrow. A few months ago, Ethan sent me a text I've kept saved. It said simply, and I get it now, "Thank you for never needing to borrow against me to prove it." If you've ever felt like you were losing your child to someone who could offer more, faster, easier, I want you to know 2 things. First, that consistency isn't invisible forever. It just takes longer to be recognized than a gift wrapped in a bow. And second, that generosity built on borrowed trust always comes due eventually one way or another. Keep showing up. Keep the folder, even if you never think you'll need it. This has been my story. If it moved you, share it with a parent who's still showing up quietly, waiting to be seen.